Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Hi, everybody. I know I don't look like Andrew Houghtonville, but I'm Denise Roselle, and I am your host today. Andrew is not with us today, so I'm Denise Roselle. I am the Director of Policy Innovation at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. That's AUCD. Next slide, Karen. So this is the nTIDE. There we go. This is the nTIDE Lunch and Learn. I'm here to welcome you. This is a joint effort of the University of New Hampshire, Kessler Foundation, and AUCD. It occurs at noon Eastern on the first Friday of the month with the release of the nTIDE report. We are a part of the Rehabilitation and Research Training Center on Employment Policy and Measurement, which is funded by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Next slide. Today's program. So we're starting out my welcome first, and then we're going to go to the numbers. And John O'Neill is going to be doing the numbers today from the Kessler Foundation. Then we'll come back to the nTIDE news, and I'll be doing that part, so I'll be talking to you again then. And then our guest speaker today is Michael Morris, who is the Executive Director of the National Disability Institute. And then finally, for Q&A, as they said earlier in the early slide, the first couple of parts, we will do all of the questions and answers at the end. So if you have them, type into your Q&A box, and we'll be waiting for them. Okay, John, off to you.
Thank you, Denise. Next slide, please. The monthly nTIDE report is a press release with an infographic that looks at the latest employment statistics for people with and without disabilities. And it uses data derived from the jobs report, which is released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics on the first Friday of each month. Next slide. The source of the data, as I had mentioned, it's from the Current Population Survey that is fielded by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's really the official source of the unemployment rate, which is made so much of. It is a survey of civilians aged 16 to 64 not living in institutions. And this data has been available since about 2008 onward, it's a result of the 6 disability questions being added to many of the federal surveys. The data is not yet seasonally adjusted, and that's why we compare the data that we're reporting to the same month last year. Next slide. And now for the numbers. Next slide. In terms of employment to population ratio, people with disabilities, the employment to population ratio was flat, essentially flat. This month compared to a month a year ago, it was 31.4% in each month. In terms of people without disabilities, the employment to population ratio was up a bit, about 1.2%, from 74 to 74.9%. Next slide. We also report out on the labor force participation rate, and that includes those that are working as well as those that are looking for work. And for people with disabilities, it was down slightly this month from a month year ago. Year ago, the labor force participation rate was 34.1%. And this month it was 33.7%, which is 1.2% decrease. Negligible, but still a decrease. In terms of people without disabilities, the labor force participation rate rose slightly from 76.6% last year in September to 77.4% this year, up 1%. Next slide, please. We also look at the employment to population ratio. That is literally the proportion of people within the population who are actually working. And we've been tracking this since fall of 2008. And if you look at both of these graphs, if you look at this graph, you see people without disabilities at the top, and at the bottom you see people with disabilities. And as you can see over time, since 2008, when the fall of 2008, when the Great Recession began, there was a dip in both the employment to population rate for people with and without disabilities. But the dip was much steeper for people with disabilities. And there was an upturn for people without disabilities, which started in about 2010. There was not an upturn for people with disabilities until about the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. There's been a continued increase for both groups over time, yet the disparity, the gap between people with and without disabilities is still quite wide, as you can see. Next slide. We actually put in a curved line, which kind of gives you a sense as to where the trend is going for people with and without disabilities. It looks like the trend line is still increasing, but slower than it was at one time for people with disabilities. The trend line for people without disabilities has continued to increase since about the beginning of 2011, end of 2010. Next slide. Okay, I'd like to turn this back to Denise for the nTIDE news.
Thanks, John. Okay, so next slide, Karen. What we generally start with on the nTIDE news is a federal policy update. So there are a number of things going on. I particularly want to update you on what's happening with appropriations. So we have talked in the past about the fact that there was a budget deal. There are numbers that have been sent to the House and Senate to say, here's the amount that you should appropriate for particular departments. So we've been waiting. The next step in that usually is to have a House bill, a Senate bill. They come together, they pass, and move forward. Right now, we are working under a continuing resolution because we do not have that. And obviously, since it is October 4th and the fiscal year started on October 1st, they had to do something or the government shuts down. They have no more money. So there's a continuing resolution. It goes to November 21st. Basically, it's flat funded, meaning everything from last year continues at this point until November 21st. At that point, again, Congress will have to have acted to do something or the government shuts down. So at this point, we have not had appropriations bills for the House or the Senate. The House passed one before, but it was before they had the budget numbers, so it really doesn't count. So the House and Senate both need to have appropriations numbers, and they need to pass. At this point, we have seen drafts of the Senate appropriations numbers. We're not quite sure what's going to happen next. As you probably, if you're living anywhere in the country or probably anywhere in the world, know that things are a little crazy in Washington right now. And you can imagine November is likely to be crazy as well. So we're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. I don't know the answer is the answer to you. We don't see, last rumors we heard at least, were that the Senate and the House weren't necessarily going to pass bills. They would just bring drafts to a conference, they'd work it out, send it to the president. We're going to have to wait and see. That's the answer. But the news for all of you folks, post October 1st, for particularly if you have federal funding for any particular programs that you work on, and I know there are a number of many programs that benefit people with disabilities for which there's federal funding. Federal funding continues. We're good until November 21st, and then we're just going to have to see what happens. Second thing that's happened, and particularly for folks on this call, we have a new Secretary of Labor at the Department of Labor. That is Eugene Scalia, son of the former Supreme Court Justice. He was confirmed and is now starting to work. And then lastly, I couldn't not say, this is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, NDEAM. The topic this month is the right talent right now. The link on the screen is to all of the materials that are available from ODEP and from others promoting this month. There's a lot of good stuff I talked about last month a little bit, and there's a slide, but a number of organizations, APSI in particular, has state-by-state data and a bunch of data available, but the entire disability community is really using National Disability Employment Awareness Month to push the movement to competitive integrated employment, and particularly to push some legislation that's going on that we've talked about before on the transformation bill, Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment from Senator Casey. So go to AUCD's website, go to APSI's website, go to whoever your organization is. I guarantee you there'll be something up there around competitive integrated employment, and this is the month to really push it. Okay, next slide. Some other interesting things in what I would call federal policy, but not necessarily legislative. We have a new guidance from and I think I've said before on these calls, part of my job, in addition to working with you guys, is to TIPS and programs, the inclusive post-secondary education for students with intellectual disabilities. So there has been some confusion out in the world, in the states, in the VR departments, about what funding from VR or from IDEA could be used to support students in these inclusive post-secondary programs. There is a new guidance that came out from the Department of Education on September 17th that very specifically says IDEA Part B funds and VR funds may be used, may, not shall, may be used to support students with disabilities in dual enrollment programs and in comprehensive transition programs. Those are the inclusive post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities. This has not been clear in the past. It's been clear to us. It's been clear, frankly, I would say it was clear in the regs. It was clear in preambles to the regs. RSA, we met with the commissioner yesterday. RSA says it's been clear to them, but it is not clear out in the states. So this is a very specific document. It's in a Q&A form, so it's really understandable, and with an appendix that gives more detail. It's one of those things that I would say, if this is an area in which you are involved and interested, print it out, go to your VR folks, talk about, this is stuff we can do together. We are all in this together. We are all there to make sure that students get what they need. And how can we now work together to figure out where we can share funding, braid funding. It also reaffirms that students in these programs can receive certain types of student financial aid. Again, something that's been clear, but this is reaffirmed. So I had to share that one. It's part of the rest of the work I do, but it also is work that we've really promoted students in these programs and are getting, the data we shows they're getting better outcomes and better jobs and better pay and more independent living skills, et cetera, coming out of the programs. Okay, Next slide. Another one that's kind of a federal, next slide, Karen, got it? There we go. No, next one. No, next, that's the wrong way, other way. I think the next slide is on, there we go. So I've got a number of things this month, probably because it is NDEAM, it is the Disability Employment Month, a number of things from ODEP and various of its partners. This one I thought was really interesting. It's from the SEED project. We had probably a year and a half ago, somebody from SEED, from ODEP, came in and talked about this program. It is a joint program between Council of State Governments, National Conference of State Legislators, and ODEP and others, but particularly those folks. And it's around policy around employment. A lot of the Employment First stuff is tied into this. The Work Matters report that you may be familiar with that came out a number of years ago came out of this. So this one is specific to employment for veterans with disabilities. And there are 12 specific policy options that states can work on to facilitate transition into the civilian workforce for veterans with disabilities. It talks about strategies states are using. It talks about very specific policies around, I pulled it out because I wanted to share them with you, veteran employment preferences, career development and job placement, employer certification, apprenticeships, tax credits, occupational licensing, career-specific programs, veteran-owned businesses, female veteran programs, paid leave, transportation access, a whole variety of things. Obviously states have been very interested in addressing issues of veterans coming home, and particularly veterans with disabilities. I don't know if you're aware, I found this statistic interesting. There's 11.2 million veterans in the country, 7.3% of the population, and 1/3 of those have a service-connected disability. So the fact that NCSL and the Council of State Governments and ODEP together are trying to make some state policy changes and giving opportunities to states and saying, you know, here's best practice. Here's something that another state is doing to facilitate employment and transition into employment for these vets with disabilities. I thought was really nice. And particularly this month, that was really nice. Okay, next slide, Karen. This is another one. This is by the RRTC on employment for individuals with blindness or other visual impairments at Mississippi State. I've been involved in a lot of conversations lately. I also have talked to you about the fact that I've been involved in the Promise TA Center. Lots of conversations lately about folks who really don't understand that youth can work and still receive SSI. That there are, this one is targeted specifically to youth who are blind or visually impaired, specifically talks about work incentives and calculations. That should be and links, not add links, to more information. It's a really simple document that I thought was really clear. So, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about this recently. Okay, next slide. Another one that's come out, again, this one's from EARN and ODEP, Employer Assistance and Resource Network. And this one is on neurodiversity in the workplace. And it's it's a pretty simple, straightforward, defines what is neurodiversity, explores benefits for employers and employees, talks about accommodating people with neurocognitive disabilities, has some stuff around evaluating job descriptions and how you modify interview methods, providing job accommodations. They also have a roundtable, which is an employer roundtable that I thought was interesting. So this is another one that's just out from ODEP and EARN, and I thought that was a really cool one as well. Okay, next slide. I mentioned Promise a minute ago. As I've said, AUCD has the contract for the Promise Technical Assistance Center. So this came out. I couldn't not share this with you. There's a brand new issue, special issue. Plus, I get a lot of questions from people about Promise and what were the lessons and what did we learn and et cetera. So there's a brand new JVR, Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, special issue. There are 16 articles. It is open sourced. Anybody can access any of the articles. And it's by all, it has articles by all of the 6 Promise projects, and with 16 articles, obviously several of them are multiples. And it talks about lessons learned, how to engage youth, what are the effect of work incentive benefits, counseling. You know, I just pulled out topics on a few of them so you could get the idea. Teaching self-determination and how to engage families, recruiting participants in randomized trials. I thought that was interesting because the projects, I think, it wasn't as easy to recruit participants as some thought it was going to be. There's a cost-benefit analysis by one of the project. I really recommend this one to you, particularly because it's open sourced. It really gives a lot of information. And because this was a randomized trial, you know, the final data and lessons are not going to come out from the evaluator, that's Mathematica, for several years. So this is a really good start to see what the projects learned. And if anyone happens to be coming to the AUCD conference, as an aside, there are going to be several sessions on promise specifically, several breakouts by the projects. Anyway, next slide. Another one this one was kind of interesting too. This is on I probably should have put this up with the conversation about the guidelines. This was a systematic review of post-secondary transition interventions. It looks at 6 international databases and 2,385 participants ages 13 to 28, and found that, not surprisingly, because we're finding some of this data as well, improvement in at least one of the following: at college enrollment, self-determination, self-confidence, social and vocational self-efficacy, autonomy, social support, career exploration, transition skills, improvements in at least one of those areas for these students. And that's a really nice one for when folks are looking for data. I thought, particularly because it was international, I thought it was really interesting. Next slide, Karen. International, another international one. These two popped up on my screen, just kind of, I don't know, I didn't expect them. They just both popped up. And I thought they were both really interesting. One from Nigeria, one from Botswana. The one from Nigeria, and they're both about interviews with folks with disabilities in these countries, about what's going on in these countries. We certainly had, I think a year ago, somebody from the State Department project, bringing folks in from Tanzania, Uganda, I think Nigeria, who came in and talked about the project, bringing folks here or sending folks there. This is, Nigeria is interesting because they actually have new legislation in January 2019 on against discrimination against people with disabilities that went into effect January 2019. They've ratified a number of the international instruments, but no surprise, because we run into this here as well. There are significant problems in how people with disabilities are being integrated and what the state is actually doing. So this comes up with some ideas of things that could happen. There are interviews with people with disabilities. I think there's, no, the Botswana one is the one that has interviews. The Nigerian one, I'm not sure, is specific interviews. But I just thought they were both interesting that they both popped up together. The one from Botswana, Botswana has not signed the CRPD, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But they have not ratified, and this is looking at interviews with 30 people within individuals with disabilities in the country, saying, you know, what are the basic challenges? What are you facing? What are the issues that are important to fix? What are you finding? And again, I thought it was really an interesting one, not only that they popped up together, but particularly this one too was on interviews with people. And I think I have not shared as much international news in recent months, and I wanted to be sure I brought this one to you specifically. Next slide. There are a couple things going on that you might want to know about. This one you need to know the deadline is October 7th. It was a deadline, I think, the end of September, but they've extended a week. ODEP is doing another one of their online dialogues. This one is in partnership with DOT, Department of Transportation, and the Federal Transit Administration. There's places to put comments on all of these topics: trip planning and monitoring, payment at the station, vehicle trips, transferring, pedestrian space, specifically to barriers and solutions to complete trips for all. And I always like to tell you about these. They really do pay attention to these, I can tell you. They're looking for comments. They're really easy to file too. It's a very much a go in, just write it in. They're looking for, when I say public comment, I don't mean like when you comment to regulations and that kind of more complicated stuff. This is very direct, and they're looking for individualized comments. So go in, it expires now October 7th. They've extended, and it really is an important way to get information in. How often do we talk about the fact that, you know, if you can't get to work, it doesn't matter if you have the job. So let's make sure that we comment on this one. And then the next thing, next slide, Karen. The next one is JAN, the Job Accommodations Network, just came out with their series of webinars for 2019-2020. And there's some really, the first one is the 8th of October. And the first one I think is the one on digital accessibility. But these are the upcoming, some of the upcoming topics. Obviously it's once a month for an hour. Jan always does a really good job on their Accommodations Network stuff. I mean, Jan is on their webinars. There's very specific, like there's some on assistive technology basics. Like I said, the next one's on digital accessibility. There's an ADA information request one they always do. There's a tie-in to return to work and stay at work, which is certainly one of the big ODEP priorities right now. The fact that they listed all of them, gave all the dates, all the ways to register, I thought was really nice. And the link is there on the screen on this on the slide. Okay, next slide. I think that was the end of it. Yeah, so this is the next one, which is just be sure and save the date. February 11th is the release of the annual disability statistics compendium for, that's the 2020. It's the February 11th here in Washington. It'll be, you can be here and some of us will be here for it, or you can watch it online. There'll be a link coming soon for registration. Mark your calendars. It's always really interesting data, and you know, it's the annual, so it's an important one. Okay, next slide. I think that's to Michael, right? Yeah, okay. So our speaker this morning, I'm really excited. This is the second of a three-part series we've been running around poverty and banking and savings within the disability community and for people with disabilities. Frankly, nobody knows more about this than Michael Morris these days. Michael is the executive director of the National Disability Institute. He's got more than 30 years. I think the first time I met Michael, he was still back at UCP, literally like 30 years ago. So he and I have both been around longer than I probably need to say. So anyway, he has more than 30 years of experience in and outside of government, pioneering new strategies to improve the lives of people with disabilities. He serves as an advisor and technical expert to multiple federal agencies to advance economic stability for people with disabilities. I'm really excited to have you here, Michael, and I'm going to toss the mic to you.
Thanks, Denise. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. If we can go to the next slide. So my presentation today to you is titled Employment as a Means, Financial Stability as the End Goal. I'm the executive director of the National Disability Institute. All the paintings that are behind a lot of the text were done by artists with disabilities. If we can go to the next slide. So some of you may be familiar with National Disability Institute. I founded it and have been its executive director from the beginning some 15 years ago. And we really focus on using our imagination to innovate and produce impact on advancing better economic stability, better financial inclusion for people with disabilities. Next slide. So I want to talk with you about financial behavior. People with disabilities are living in or near poverty. As you see with the slide, the comparison to people without disabilities is pretty stark, 28% versus 13%. And despite significant reductions in poverty for women and people of color over the past 5 years, individuals with disabilities have seen no such reductions. Next slide. Next slide, please. Financial stress among people with disabilities is significant. You see in this infographic multiple data points. People with disabilities are almost 3 times more likely to have extreme difficulty paying their bills. People with disabilities are almost 2 times more likely to skip medical treatments because of cost. They're also more likely to report that they cannot come up with $2,000 if any unexpected situation or need arises. And then we also know that people with disabilities are more likely to skip a mortgage payment, are more likely to be overdrawn in a checking account, and are more likely to take money in advance from a retirement account. Again, this is related to their financial instability, and much of it results from the statistics we heard earlier today about the level of participation in the labor force. Next slide, please. So what I want to focus on with you is what I hope we can draw is a new collective wisdom. So many of us, nonprofit organizations, service delivery organizations, and employment related services, policy advocates, so many of us focus on employment, which is an important goal, but it's not the end goal. It's the means to achieve financial stability and security through financial empowerment is really the end goal. Next slide, please. What is financial empowerment? Well, it's it's a multi-part definition. Financial empowerment is really about accessing affordable financial services. It's about having available financial education to improve knowledge and understanding to make informed financial decisions. It's about economic pathways to financial stability and security. And it's about overcoming barriers which really, from many of our means-tested public benefits programs, creates a dependence on public benefits, which keeps a person in a poverty status. Next slide, please. Financial empowerment, I think, for all of us needs to be seen. This isn't a fringe issue for some others to take care of. It's fundamental to the definition of community participation and inclusion. It's fundamental to solving other intractable social issues. Poverty, of course, unemployment and underemployment, hunger, homelessness. And in fact, financial instability ties directly, there's a cause and effect with poor physical and mental health. Next slide, please. I think all of us could agree that we as a nation can do better. And National Disability Institute over the past 15 years has been working with nonprofit organizations nationwide, with government at a local, state, and national level, with the financial community, with policymakers to change thinking, change behavior, and look at how we change policy. Next slide, please. I want to focus with you on 3 areas. The first is ABLE, Achieving a Better Life Experience Act. The second is access to financial education and counseling. And the third is to increase your awareness and understanding about inclusive community development and the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA. Next slide, please. Let's look at ABLE first. For the ABLE accounts, and some of you may be more aware than others, but ABLE accounts came into law at the very end of President Obama's term, and it creates a tax advantage savings account for people with disabilities who meet eligibility requirements. There are some 8 million eligible individuals with disabilities in this country right now, but in year 4 of program implementation, only 50,000 of those 8 million have opened accounts at this point. So there's a massive need for greater efforts at education and outreach that cuts across federal agencies, that cuts across community nonprofits, that cuts across all stakeholders in the disability community. Next slide, please. A little bit more about ABLE. ABLE was named after one of the originators of the concept, Stephen Beck, from Northern Virginia. It amends the federal tax code. It's actually Section 529 in the federal tax code. Some of you may be familiar with Section 529, College Savings Account, that creates a new option for eligible individuals with disabilities. As I mentioned, save money in a tax-exempt account that may be used for qualified disability expenses while still keeping your eligibility for federal public benefits. So there can be no harm done. Because you have an ABLE account, it is excluded as an asset. So whether it's Medicaid, Social Security, it could be a housing, it could even be food assistance, which are means-tested federal benefits. They could not be impacted in any way adversely to an individual who has opened and is growing an ABLE account. Next slide, please. What's the current ABLE, current ABLE picture? Thank you. There are 42 states that have created ABLE programs based on the federal rules. 42 states and the District of Columbia. There are 50,000 accounts that have been opened nationwide. There have already been put aside in those accounts over $250 million. The average account size is $5,000. Next slide, please. What are some common misperceptions about ABLE accounts? Well, probably the greatest, beyond people's lack of awareness and understanding that ABLE accounts is even an option for people to consider, is a fear of loss of benefits. Despite what I said to you a moment ago, there are many people believe that somehow, if they open an ABLE account, they're going to lose their Social Security benefit, or they're going to lose access to Medicaid and health assistance and community-related services. That's absolutely false. Some people simply say they can't afford to contribute to funds, but it's not limited in contributions just to the individual beneficiary. Employers could contribute. Community nonprofits working with people with disabilities could contribute. Obviously, family and friends could contribute. Others say they never heard of the ABLE accounts I talked of. And here's another one that is another major misconception. There are many people with a special needs trust or participate in a pooled income trust, and they say, well, I have that. I don't need an ABLE account. Again, they're wrong. There are things you can do with funds being dispensed from an ABLE account, whether short or long-term, meeting short or long-term needs, which cannot be done by a special needs trust, particularly related to housing. Next slide, please. So where do you learn more about ABLE? National Disability Institute manages the ABLE National Resource Center on behalf of 20 of the largest national disability nonprofits in the country. Every month we run a webinar. They're free. It has a massive website, everything you could possibly want to know about ABLE, ablenrc.org. There's a monthly newsletter, and there is also a roadmap we have created to understand the different steps to opening an account and then managing and growing an account. And now, for the first time, just this past week, we have opened up a financial literacy component of ABLE on the CalABLE website. It's called the Achievable Corner, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. Future outreach strategies we're now engaged in is working with employers to help seed and match ABLE accounts for employees with disabilities. We're talking with credit unions about education and outreach to their 100 million members nationwide. We've been talking with the Children's Miracle Network Hospital Association, children's hospitals across the country who see a lot of ABLE-eligible children, and of course, outreach to disability organizations. Next slide, please. This is the roadmap I was speaking about just a few moments ago. It takes you through the steps of thinking about why would I open an ABLE account? What would be my financial goals to put money in an account? It talks about growing a circle of support, who might contribute to my account. And then after opening an account, how do I manage it? How do I create a budget, whether that's for short-term needs or balancing that against long-term needs? I would tell you across the country, we've talked with so many thousands of people who've opened ABLE accounts. Probably the number one thing that I hear about is people who want to live in a home of their own. They want to move from where they're currently living, which is at home with their family or in a group situation, and they'd like to live more independently. But others talk about access to their own transportation. Others talk about access to technology that no government benefit is covering. And it even can cover the costs of healthcare costs that are a gap, that are not completely covered under Medicaid, Medicare, or even some private insurance. So there's a lot of ways you can use the dollars saved that are growing through a choice of savings or investment options. And the result is, just as what ABLE stands for, achieving a better life experience. Next slide, please. So how do we produce transformational change within the VR and workforce development programs? Next slide. So we need to seize the higher ground. We need to think about whether you're part of a vocational rehabilitation agency or you're a community nonprofit working with VR, providing employment-related services and supports. We need to integrate into individual employment plans access to benefits and financial counseling. We need to be looking at seeding and matching ABLE accounts. we need to change expectations from employment outcomes to employment as a pathway to greater financial stability and security. Next slide, please. It's a challenge of leadership. If you're a disability employment service provider and you're providing jobs in diverse settings for people with disabilities, hopefully helping them to get the skills, to get into positions that offer continued training for greater wage growth potential, then you want to also look at ABLE accounts. How can we seed and match accounts? How can we also offer financial and benefits counseling to ease people's stress and tensions that somehow this ABLE account is going to affect adversely other public benefits people need? How can we look at all of this within increasing individual self-determination to have more choices in terms of community living and community inclusion? And most important of all, it's not just employment, it's about building this pathway out of poverty, helping people get jobs, but then helping them with understanding, what do I do with that paycheck? How do I set financial goals? How do I look to things like ABLE accounts that are going to only give me more assets that can help me in emergency situations, short-term or long-term setting goals that really change my life? Next slide, please. So part 2 is access to financial education and counseling. Financial capability is a combination of knowledge and skills to inform financial decisions and behaviors, identify opportunities to improve financial stability, and manage financial resources. Next slide. So we break down financial education and counseling with this arrow chart. Financial education provides the knowledge and skills individuals with disabilities need to take action with this increased financial capability. And then we really need to be doing more from the research perspective to be documenting outcomes. As a result of financial education and changes in thinking and behavior, what are the changes in the quality of life for individuals with disabilities? Next slide, please. The menu of employee and health benefits is beginning to turn. This is one of the fastest changing new benefits major employers are beginning to offer their employees. Financial counseling that looks at credit improvement, debt reduction, and beginning to understand in much more deeply the intersection of better financial health and better physical and mental health. So this is an emerging area. And whether you're a community nonprofit, look at your own health benefit package, or you're working with all kinds of employers, helping them look at these additional parts of their benefits menu. Next slide, please. Third part, inclusive community development. Many of you may not be familiar with the acronym CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. It was enacted in 1977. Well before the Americans with Disabilities Act, to encourage regulated financial institutions to help meet the credit needs of communities in which they operate, focusing on low and moderate income neighborhoods, consistent with safe and sound banking operations. Next slide, please. So community development, just let me give you a sense of scale here. Last year, banks in meeting CRA obligations spent $400 billion. That's with a B, $400 billion. Some banks are using their CRA activities to help benefit low and moderate income people with disabilities, but most are not. And the regulators of banks have not really focused in an intentional way that a major share of low moderate income people who must be the beneficiaries of CRA are in fact people with disabilities. In June of this year, we opened up at National Disability Institute a new center on disability inclusive community development. We're in the middle of a 5-part monthly webinar series, bringing in experts from the disability and financial communities to talk about what this could mean if we were all working more collaboratively to use the CRA requirements to change in multiple ways what's happening for low and moderate income people with disabilities. $400 billion a year being expended now. Imagine if just 1% would be $4 billion. $4 billion was expended in collaboration with cities and state government, with community nonprofits, to look at what services could support under CRA people with disabilities. Workforce development is a part of it. What can be covered? Financial literacy and counseling could be covered. Housing development could be covered. So there's really lots of areas where there really could be an intentional way to advance the economic stability and financial health and well-being of people with disabilities. Next slide, please. The center, as I mentioned, has been set up to raise broad awareness within the disability community about how do we tap into this massive private sector expenditure of dollars that they must, with banks, must do to meet CRA responsibilities. And how can we build greater connectivity between the financial services sector and the disability consumer and service provider communities? Next slide, please. I want to share with you, our next webinar is coming up very soon, very timely. It's on workforce development and meeting obligations under CRA. The featured speakers includes an expert on this topic from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and it features others who have been involved in a partnership using CRA dollars to support workforce development for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. The website here takes you to information about inclusive community development. It's part of the NDI website. It tells you about the goals and target audiences of the center. It has archived previous webinars, the material, the PowerPoints. It will tell you about upcoming webinars, and it'll give you a status report on the work of the center as we begin to plan for year 2. Next slide, please. Additional resources that you can find, and probably an article I really would urge you to read that NDI was the lead authors on. It's called Closing the Gap, Reforming the Community Reinvestment Act Regulatory Framework, which was published by Georgetown Law School just this past June. I'd urge you to look at also an annotated bibliography of relevant research and other publications. Next slide, please. So hopefully I have not too far extended beyond my time limit. I leave you with this thought. Whether it's about ABLE, or it's about financial education and counseling, or it's about thinking about inclusive community development, there are so many ways that we can improve the employment and financial stability of people with disabilities. This quote I leave you with from Zadie Smith: "Progress is never permanent, will always be threatened, must be redoubled, restated, and reimagined if it is to survive." Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That's fabulous. So we're moving on to some questions. I've got some, but I'm going to take the ones that are in the box first. So the first couple, Michael, are for you. I know my state has outreach for 529 education accounts. Is there a similar outreach for ABLE?
Yes, great question. If you go to the ABLE National Resource Center, ablenrc.org, you will see a link to every state that has created an ABLE program. The majority of them are within a state treasurer's office, but they have their own websites. And I would urge anyone on this call, get in touch with your state ABLE program. They would be more than happy to be engaged with you in education and outreach activities, make presentations, share materials with you, but that would be the place to go. Now, anyone in the country, for the most part, can choose among other state ABLE programs, but I would always start with one's own state ABLE program.
So there's also a question for you, Michael. If they can't attend the webinar, can they access it later?
Yes, this upcoming webinar on workforce development and how money can be spent by banks under Community Reinvestment Act activities. We archive those webinars, and you can find that by following the links onto the National Disability Institute website. So do not be concerned. If you do have questions you would like to ask the panelists and you can't be on, you can send them to me in advance and we'll put them into the queue. We won't get to all the questions, but we often will then send the questions on to the panelists and we'll post them later.
So then there's one here for John. So John, who I think is still there. So John, they've read the press release and the report, and they're wondering if we've had this one before, but why don't you go ahead and answer it. If there's any source of information on employment trends for people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities?
In terms of the federal surveys, pretty much the answer to that is no. There is one question amongst the 6 disability questions that tends to get at cognitive disabilities, but it doesn't distinguish between intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, unfortunately. And that has been a concern amongst researchers that look at employment outcomes for disabilities. So that is unfortunate, but not yet.
Yeah. Let me jump back, Michael. If other people have questions, please be sure you can type them into the question box and we'll answer them. I'm going to give you a question, Michael. There's a lot of talk around, there's a lot of buzz, so to speak, around the field about there aren't enough ABLE accounts that have been opened, and if we don't have any more of them opened, we might lose this whole program. And you want to address that one?
Sure. I think that one never knows where in this world of misinformation daily, how things like these kind of rumors start. But I will say this, the ABLE program is not going to go away. I think we hit, as I mentioned, 2 key milestones. 50,000 people have opened ABLE accounts in states across the country. And then, even more importantly, $250 million now exists in those accounts and are growing daily based on savings and investment choices. They won't go away. Now, if anything, there may be a shakeout over time where some states decide that the cost of running the program may be too much, and they decide to probably in some ways work with another state. There are 2 major consortia already. One is run by the State Treasurer's Office in Illinois. The other is run by the State Treasurer's Office in Ohio. Between the 2, they actually are really managing 75% of the state ABLE programs. So what that means is if you go to Pennsylvania, it will look identical to the program of the state of Illinois in terms of what your investment and savings choices are, their rules, their availability of any types of support services. So absolutely false. It is not going away, and there are amendments pending before Congress to expand it, to actually raise the age of eligibility from age of onset of disability of 26 or younger, bring it up to over age to age 46. We believe that would double the number of ABLE eligible individuals. I would also point out to you that when the 529 college savings plans first came into being, it took them almost 10 years to really begin to have traction. So we're in the early stages. I wish we were doing better. I think it's up to all of us to spread the word about the benefits of ABLE accounts.
Yeah, thank you. And I was also going to ask you if you wanted to say something about the legislation. I'm the policy geek. So thank you. There is an ABLE Age Adjustment Act in Congress. There's that's trying to raise the age limit. So I would also add that to folks. Okay, I have another one for you. How do we begin to dispel myths in communities of color, such as California, where families of people with disabilities may be fearful and lacking information about ABLE and its benefits?
Yeah, one of the disheartening facts to me is that no federal agency has taken a leadership role, whether that's IRS or Treasury or the groups we tend to work more with in the disability community, education, vocational rehabilitation, Office of Special Education Programs, ODEP at Department of Labor, Administration on Community Living, you can pick them, until recently. And I really want to give a shout out to Administration on Community Living, where Julie, who leads the disability work there, is an ABLE account owner herself and does not give a speech today without talking about ABLE. At Social Security Administration, they have added finally materials in every area office across the country about ABLE. I recently talked with Mark Schultz, the new commissioner at Rehabilitation Services Administration, RSA, that now that he's there, we need to do more. It can't be owned by any one party, whether you're a community nonprofit or a single federal agency. We all have to do more. And every state ABLE program is open to working with all of us to figure out ways, how do we amplify and echo the message? There is no downside to an ABLE account. There are only pluses, and it's why I still believe it is the greatest legislative achievement we have had in the disability community since the passage of the ADA, but is the most invisible, and we have to change that.
Good answer. I'm still waiting for other questions, but I'm going to throw you another one. One of the issues that we've come up with in Promise, because we've talked about Promise, is the working with some of the folks in what I will call kind of the poverty community, the other benefit programs, who still have a dated myth-based perception of people with disabilities and whether they can work and still retain benefits, all of those issues. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that one. How do we go about, because you're talking about that, you're working in that community. How do we address that?
Yeah, I think you take it each day at a time, one step forward at a time. Over the past 15 years, National Disability Institute has worked with so many, probably every one of the national poverty reduction groups. They wouldn't be household names to anyone on this call, probably, so I won't start listing them. But we've also reached out and worked with United Way across the country. I think that at a local level, if that's where you are, or you're at a state level, or you're a national organization, it's imperative that we continue to push forward that there is no group in this country, regardless of gender or race or ethnicity, who doesn't also have the intersection with disability that then puts them as the majority members in the poverty community. And so I'm happy to say that I have seen progress over the past 15 years. More can always be done. I think, though, it's symptomatic of the fact that the banking regulatory agencies that I regularly appear before, the FDIC, the Office of Control of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I am the lone voice related to disability. And at times that's pretty lonely. We can do better. All of our organizations need to recognize that, remember the statistic, if you remember nothing else from anything I said, $400 billion a year expended by banks to support low-income people in low-income neighborhoods nationwide. We work together on achieving a 1% change, $4 billion a year in private sector dollars for affordable and accessible housing development, for financial literacy programs, for workforce development. That expenditure annually, I think, I'm not as up on the statistics, it's got to be close to what the entire vocational rehabilitation program is annually. So it's an enormous amount of money. And there's great opportunity here, but we need to not just shrug our shoulders and say, why aren't they doing it? We need to kind of roll up our sleeves and work together with what are considered the more, the YMCAs, the urban leagues, all the groups you find, the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all of these groups in every community typically have work going on to help families reach financial stability and poverty reduction strategies. What they haven't intentionally done is recognize that we have to work with the disability community. And it's more by happenstance that it happens when it needs to be intentional.
I think that's I think the most important thing you just said, you said many important things. One thing that stuck in my head was the comment about, I won't tell you the organization's names necessarily because you won't necessarily know them. we should know them. We should know them. So we have a lot of work to do. On that, I have no more questions. I think we are right about at the hour. I'm going to say thank you, Michael. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. Thanks, John. And we will see you next month.